Gaywyck by Vincent Verga. Publisher Allison Books, Los Angeles, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 10. Immediately following his departure, I spent the days alone in meditation, attempting to manage the feelings that attended this excess of love. My will to succeed kindled the desire to understand, and fastened a leash of longing that led to reliving shared moments, pairing them to their essential truths. I had pressed myself to seek and find a friend. A great cloud of unknowing had been lifted. I knew the more accustomed I grew to this mystical surrender of will, the more fully whole I would become. I was beginning to see the difference between self-interest and self-love. The former is the death of the soul. The later, the way to loving another. A long for no other treasure but love, for it alone can make us pleasing to God. I read in Saint Therese of Lisieux's autobiography. I bade myself look forward and let past time be, but that was easier said than done. About this time, nightmares again tormented me. I frequently collapsed into bed after dinner, barely able to remove my clothing, only to awaken in a blackest night from horrifying images involving the loss of my vision. Blunt and sharp instruments gouged out my eyes, but always by accident. A tree branch snapped back by an unknown hand. "Oh, God, not again!" I would moan before being wrenched from sleep by my own screams. The toll was a heavy one. I would feel out of focus the entire next day, as though I'd overindulged in champagne the previous evening, and the absence of rest exacerbated minor tensions. I never connected the dreams with the liquid in my bedside water jug. I had no reason to. A letter arrived from my father. It was short and direct. He wanted me to write my mother, who was still lost in the abyss of her mistress depression. He thought a letter from me might have some therapeutic effect. He enclosed her new address, as she had been moved to another hospital. I was ashamed for having forgotten her. Oh, she was ever present in my heart, but she was of another world. The ideal of writing a letter had never occurred to me. Fascinated as I was by the newly discovered science of love, I sat down immediately after breakfast and began, "Dearest Mamma," but could go no further than that. I had never written to her before. What was I to say? I went out for a walk. Off the avenue of lindens, toward the sea, there is a sunken garden. Down 3 stone steps is a small circular clearing in the woods, a hollow, connected to the beach by a narrow tunnel through the trees and tall underbrush. At the center of the hollow is a druid's dolmen from Connemara. I sat contemplating the autumnal tints. The witch hazel was still a distance from the quine's color it would achieve. Everything around me is changing. I thought, how could I expect to remain the same? I opened my writing pad and began. "Dearest Mamma, I am having the greatest adventure of my life. I am making a friend. I have wanted to write to you often, but I could never decide where to begin. Today, I'll begin at the beginning." I described the house and the gardens in detail. It was an optimistic letter, with all the shadows excised. She had enough of her own. I was quite pleased with it. I read and reread it, delighted I was able to express succinctly much of what I was feeling. I enclosed a white spider mum, one of our favorite flowers. At luncheon, I asked Denvers how to post the letter. He explained that Ambrose was responsible for the mail pouch, making certain it reached the gatehouse every morning in time to be collected. I had missed that day's run. He suggested I take advantage of the beautiful afternoon and deliver it to town myself. If I rode along the main carriage path, turning left at the gatehouse, I could ride through the park to the heart of town. How do I get out of the park? There's a second gatehouse near the farm operated by Sunders. The post office is directly opposite the bound tree. The bound tree. An ancient oak that once marked the parish boundary. It's the only tree left on the wharf. Have you never heard of bound trees? No? And you a country boy, too. Good Lord. Soon there will be nothing left of our heritage. I was delighted with the prospect of a long, solitary ride. I changed into the old boots I used for riding and walked to the stable, where I politely requested Anita. Mr. Harrington was pleased. I would be exercising the mare. His son had twisted an ankle playing with Kale. The puss does gadabout, I thought as I trotted down the curved path toward the carriageway. The letter weighed heavily in my pocket. Had I been too glib? Had I placed myself too securely at the center of Gaywyck, aggrandizing my position as librarian by painting myself companion to the lord of the manor? Good Lord. Taking it from my pocket, I tore it in half and threw it into the undergrowth. I felt rage coming, reining in the horse. I turned her back to the stable, determined to compose a more sensible missive. It took minutes for me to regret my hasty actions. There were several perfectly acceptable paragraphs that would be more than adequate. I need not include everything the first time I wrote. I went back to collect it. The letter was not to be found. Up and down that path I rode at one point, dismounting to cover the area by foot. My foolishly romantic letter had mysteriously disappeared. When I got back to the stable, I assured Mr. Harrington that I hadn't ridden at a frenzied gallop, but had stupidly lost the letter and planned to write another, which I promptly did. Retracing my way on docile Anita, eyes raking the underbrush, I nearly rode over the object of my search. The epistle lay in the middle of the path. There was no wind strong enough to have carried it. There was no way it could have rolled in or slithered of its own volition. Yet, there it was, in the center of the trail. And, stranger still, it looked mended. The two portions were side by side, forming a perfect packet. I dismounted only long enough to retrieve my property. The mum I had enclosed was missing. I was flabbergasted at the idea of someone, anyone, perusing that ridiculous emotional disclosure. I saw myself reading Danough Gaylord's journal and cringed, causing Anita to quicken her pace. Who would remove the flower? Had it fallen from the torn letter when the kind soul who retrieved it had put it in the path of someone going toward the house? I put it out of my mind. The day was brilliantly clear and cool. Indian summer seemed on the decline. I studied the trees. I listened to the birds. I sang. I talked to the mare who flicked her ears to let me know she appreciated the attention. In the distance, where the path veered leftward, I could see the gatehouse. Somewhere, a cow coughed overhead, somber clouds banked. At the honeysuckle-covered, smaller gatehouse, a hulking elderly man introduced himself. Saunders seemed to know all about me. We discussed the weather, then he called his wife to meet me. After we exchanged greetings, she asked if I had noticed anything peculiar or out of the way on my ride through the park. The Mrs. means, White. Did you see any ghosts? I shook my head solemnly. I believe in ghosts. I also believe that if I'd passed a ghost, I'd know. The missus swears there's a ghost in the park. I tell her it's the poachers, but she don't believe me. Let her have ghosts, I say, if it makes her happy. Poachers. don't steal pies, Gregory, and you know it. Poachers steal anything they have a mind to. And your pies are pretty special, missus. Everyone in the village knows it. And don't you got something to do in the house? A good day, Mr. White. Ride carefully and take good care of Anita. There you are. I thought ghosts. I was jesting, but it was closer to the truth than I realized. The port, according to Denver's, had originally been settled in 1641 by English Puritans, who colonized Long Island because Massachusetts was becoming too populous and too licentious. They purchased the land from the agent of the Earl of Stirling, and in his honor called it Sterling Harbor. After bartering with the Indians 16 coats and 60 bushels of corn, they built their dugouts and planted crops of hay, oats, and corn in fields fertilized with fish in the Indian manner. In the beginning, all the men were farmers, fishermen, and soldiers at once, but as the years passed, Sterling Harbor became a whaling port of some renown. To its future regret, others were allowed to acquire lucrative import connections with the West Indies that would have maintained Sterling Harbor's prosperity when the whaling industry died as the whales departed for safer waters. The village of 120 souls was transformed into a poor fishing port long before the Great Storm of 1845 destroyed its harbor structures. The boats and every piece of net in the area, Grandfather Gaylord rebuilt and replaced everything. He lent the capital, charging a token interest, so the proud villagers would not scorn his offer as charity. To show their collective gratitude, they renamed the Mag's Tavern Gaylord's Inn. Grandfather Gaylord was very pleased and never informed them that their local bank, which for years bought land and foreclosed on scores of outstanding mortgages, was owned by himself. Unknowingly, the village had placed Gaylord's name on his own property. He offered his railroad to transport there his fish, clams, oysters, lobsters, and scalps. By means of judicious management, he kept the now prosperous village a limited but profitable investment. Danough's Lane, the main street, follows the plan of the original Pond Road of 1645. Circling the pond, it runs through the center of the village and stops just short of the harbor. Several yards beyond the pond, the ancient gnarled oak grows imperiously, encircled by carefully tended flower beds and a tiny green of its own. To the right is the post office. Next to it is the shop of Thomas Adams, Esquire, cordwainer. The sign intrigued me. Mr. Adams, a shoe and bootmaker, greeted me at the door. I asked him about the sign. On the walls inside, old lasts and awls were hung for decoration. He offered me a seat opposite his work table and discoursed on his ancestors, workers in Cardigan leather, who had founded the business in 1670. After generation, he refused to change the sign, although the word cordwainer had passed from the language. Everyone around here knows what I do, he explained, and Gaylord prefers it this way too. Before leaving, I introduced myself. He said he had an order from Gaylord to cobble me a pair of riding boots. He measured my feet and took impressions of both. He showed me sketches of different boots. When I made my selection, he remarked that I'd chosen a pair exactly like a pair he'd made for Danough Gaylord. He must have been wearing them when we went riding. More than likely. Every time he comes into the village, he stops to tell me how pleased he is with them. I'm making another pair now. Your foot's very similar to his. You his kin? No. Funny. I could have sworn you were related. You can learn a great deal from people's feet. Certain you're not? Positive. Can I have these in brown leather? I'll make them as Mr. Gaylord ordered. Chagrin leather boots. Only the finest chagrin. You'll be satisfied. If not, you come and tell me why, and I'll fix them. I thanked him and went to post my letter. Afterward, I rode down Danough Lane to the harbor. Turning right along Harbor Lane, I proceeded several hundred yards in order to have a complete view of the church. The narrow bell tower had caught my eye, but the white shingled oblong structure beneath it did not captivate my imagination until I noticed the cemetery behind its black iron fence. Dismounting, I climbed the small rise overhead. Dull gray clouds swollen with rain darkened to black at the gate. I paused to search for the Gaylord plot. A marble figure of the angel Gabriel beckoned from under an expansive chestnut tree. On his pedestal were inscribed the glad tidings that the Gaylords rested in his guarded domain. Gabriel presides over paradise, my father's voice instructed. He is the spirit of truth. It was he who dealt death and destruction to the sinful cities of the plain. It was he who brought man the gift of hope. There were 3 small headstones carved with names and dates of father, mother, and son, Cormac. I stood beside Cormac Gaylord's grave and introduced myself, as I would have done to formal family portraits. Bending, I plucked some sunk foil to be pressed into my journal. The wind had risen. The storm was racing closer. Gabriel, I whispered, may they rest in peace. Lead the blind to sight. Love your kindred spirit. Cormac, a dark antagonist as well. Gulls screeched. I attended the rumblings of the heavens and scrambled back to Anita, who eagerly turned homeward. I was about halfway through the park when it began to rain. The birds had ceased their singing. I urged Anita on, anxious to reach home before the storm broke. That talk of ghosts and poachers had made me edgy. We galloped all the way to the stable, where I returned Anita to Mr. Harrington's charge. Crossing from the stalls to the main house, I heard the roar of thunder. Terrified by the lightning, I detoured hastily, running at tremendous speed, and reached the far side of the cottage just as the deluge began. I pressed up against one of the library's French windows to protect my body as best I could, pleased I had not made for the wych elm on the other side. Lightning flashed nearby. At first, I thought I'd magically tumbled through the panes like Alice through her looking-glass, but the rain soaking the rug around me was coming in through the open window. My weight had forced the lock. I stood up to close the window. I felt dazed. If the heavy carpet hadn't broken my fall, I might have done serious damage to my spine or my neck, or my head, or my... I stopped in mid-conjecture. I no longer felt anything. I no longer heard the storm. In front of the fireplace, scattered on the hearthstone, I saw a torn, white spider mum. Reader, I was dumbfounded. Could I be mistaken? Taking the damp envelope from my pocket, I searched through it again. No flower. Crossing to the hearth, I knelt. Heat emanated from the coals in the grate. Someone had been in the room not too long ago. I picked up a small mound of the mum's petals, stamen, sepal, and pistil. Someone standing in front of the fire had dismembered the mum and dropped it, piece by piece, to the hearthstone. While reading my letter? Somewhere in the house, the door closed. Outside, thunder crashed. I thrust the flower's fragments into my pocket. I hesitated a moment before lighting the lamp on the mantel and carried it out into the foyer. I cannot explain my foolhardy behavior beyond my feeling of comfort in that house. It could not be haunted by some dreadful poltergeist. I reasoned I would sense it. Someone, an amiable poacher, was living or resting there. I believed it was my duty to protect my employer's property. In the foyer, I listened for a sound to guide me. There was only the rain. Up the staircase I went to the second floor landing. The sitting room was empty. A bolt of lightning outlined the witch elm in the windows. I walked down the corridor, pausing at each closed door, as if to divine by inner logic the one hiding the object of my search. At the end of the hallway, I found stairs leading to the third floor. I climbed and peered down the corridor. Another flash illuminated the passage. Nothing to stimulate suspicion. I turned and continued up the stairs to the unsound attic. There is something about attics, I thought. And if the door is locked, the door swung open. Another flash traced the top branches of the great tree outside. The panes to my left. Under those attic beams, the light revealed a mattress, a table, and a square object leaning against the wall below the window. I turned up the lamp and held it above my head. The square object below the window was a painting in an ornate gilded frame. I moved closer. The picture was of a woman in a blue robe. She had long white arms and stood in an open door with sunlight streaming over her. Her face was in darkness. I moved closer. The open door was stained glass. This was the Rossetti portrait. Light exploded. I felt the house move and leaped into the air with a terrified shout. A demented bellow from a room below echoed mine. I started to tremble violently, glancing at the painting as I turned to flee. I saw the face was not in darkness. There was no face. Someone had cut it from the canvas. Turning, I fled, sobbing from shock and fear. I knew the lies would soon consume me like fire from heaven. I rushed down the flights of steps and sped along the corridors. Halfway down the main staircase, I realized the library door was open. I had closed it. There was no way out except the way I'd come in. I could go back up, but what then? Looking over the banister, I noticed an open doorway under the stairs. I could hear a distraught person pacing in the library. I lowered my quaking self over the banister and made my way with footsteps muffled by the storm. The basement turned out to be a room with stone floor, brick walls, and a wooden door. It was empty. Beyond that door was a storage area for wine, thousands of bottles and bookcases set perpendicular to the walls. I tiptoed down the narrow central aisle. There was not a window to be seen. Another wooden door opened on stone stairs. I descended, counting to 14. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about the square room where I stood, so I sat on the bottom step. It was a windowless dungeon, the perfect place to be buried, I thought. Nothing festive about it. Holding the lamp high to make certain I was not overlooking anything, I saw the wall, directly to my right, slightly ajar. Moving toward the aperture, I extended my hand, just like something from Mary Shelley. My touch set the wall in motion. Silently, it began to close. By the judicious intervention of my foot, motion was halted before the way was sealed. I stared. The door had been camouflaged to blend in with the wall. In short, a secret passageway. I had stumbled upon the entrance. Or the exit, I mumbled, thrusting the lamp into the tunnel. I saw that the narrow way was endless, like Hugo's Parisian sewer system. Suddenly, above and behind me, I heard footsteps. I had no choice. Stepping into the passage, I closed the wall. The tunnel was tall enough for me to hold the lamps aloft, and wide enough so when walking in the middle, I could not touch the sides. I could see 10 feet in front of me. The square tunnel was red brick. The effect was somewhat like walking up a moldy chimney. The air was damp but plentiful. I walked quickly, free of strain, until a black wall loomed in front, giving rise to an attack of panic and claustrophobia. that nearly caused me to fold at the knees until my shaft of light took a sharp left, forming an acute right angle. I stopped to reconsider. I had fled the cottage near the rear on the left side, behind the wych elm. I had walked under the garden beside the pond, and was now turning toward the main house. I walked for another 10 minutes, when the passage abruptly widened into a room and ended at a heavy wooden door. The door was locked. The door was huge. I faltered. Retracing my steps was no problem, but what awaited at the other end decidedly was. Placing the lamp on the floor beside me, I sat down to rest and to think. I studied the door, a great noble door of sturdy wood, studded with immense square-headed tenons, but no knob. Impossible to break down, burn down, shoot down, and very difficult to chop down. It would probably hold back a marauding army. Of course, I said aloud, feeling brilliant. If the South attacked the North, or if the North attacked the Southerners occupying this territory, what a wonderful place to hide, and to make certain they weren't trapped. There was an escape route to my right at the base of the doorframe. I noticed a small ring attached to one of the red bricks. Slipping my forefinger into the brass circle, I pulled. Nothing happened. I pulled harder. Still nothing happened. Surely something should be happening. God damn it! The brick should come loose, uncovering a key on a niche. I've read too much Braden not to know that maybe nothing does happen, and I go back to discover one crazed cow in the sitting room. And while muttering to myself, I changed position for better leverage. Knees apart, head resting on the door, I yanked with all my strength. The ring slid out of the wall on a chain 6 inches long. The door gave way, pushed by my skull as I toppled forward. I scraped my head, and a tiny trickle of blood ran down the side of my face. No simple key for these people. Peeled one into the wall. Never misplace it. I brushed my trousers and patted my head with a handkerchief. I've finally drawn blood with my meddling. Thank Christ, it's my own. I found myself in another dungeon. A circular staircase on my left led up to a door. A long corridor extended to my right. If I was correct in my calculation, I was standing under the ivy-colored right wing. But the high room encompassed the first floor as well, which included the area behind the small study with the reflecting Della Francesca. Somewhere, keys jangled and footsteps sounded. Turning down my lamp seconds before light flashed out at the end of the long corridor, I slipped behind the door and peered through a space retained for that purpose. I wanted to see who approached and why. A slight ache marked the place on my head where the bleeding had stopped. The corridor light, dim at first, then brighter and brighter, passed, balanced on a tray with covered dishes carried by Mr. O'Shea. When he moved out of my field of vision, I opened the door, further to see him maneuver up the circular stairs. At the top, he paused, fumbled with keys, but the door opened by itself. "Right on time as always, dear," a woman's voice spoke. "I made you something special for tea today, Ruby scones and rum butter. Are you feeling better?" The door closed behind him. I wasted not a second, out I sprang, closing the wall and nipping down the corridor. I guided myself with my hand against the stones, afraid to use the lamp lest I be discovered. When I reached the door, I stopped and listened. What would I say if someone were to see me? How would I explain not having shown myself to Mr. O'Shea? I leaned against the door while slowly twisting the gold knob. The door was heavy, but swung easily, and then I was in the still room. The door was camouflaged with stocked shelves to look like the other crowded walls up 3 steps, and I was in the wine cellar. Up 6 more, and I was outside the servants' hall. Again, I listened tensely at the door before tugging it ajar to check the room, which to my astonished relief was deserted. Out I shot like a captive butterfly from the hand of the oppressor, and just as confused as to direction of flight, I had no clue where I was. Then, from the sunlight on its panes, I spotted the exit. After hastily dropping the lamp behind the espelard apple tree to the left of the kitchen door, I sat by the dairy well to calm myself. Beside me, several dozen clams in a bucket of water and cornmeal cleaned themselves for our dinner. Their presence eased me back into the real world. As I rounded the orangery, Denver's was working on the patio, trimming the bleached hawthorn with nail clippers. "Is Brian with Ambrose?" he asked. "I have no idea. Shall I go look?" "Didn't he come back with you?" "No." "Should he have?" "Yes, of course. I sent him to the stable with 2 umbrellas. When I saw the rain, I gave him a key to the cottage. Had you not been able to reach here in time, didn't you see him?" "No, I never saw Brian. Excuse me, I must go change." "I don't know what to do about that boy. He's becoming more eccentric every day. Don't be late for tea, Robert." He turned his attention back to the stray hawthorn branches. I crossed the patio and entered the house through the library. Assuming my portico windows had been closed and probably locked before the storm, I wanted to closet myself with my frenetic imagination to have it out once and for all. It was Brian in the cottage, not a cow or a poacher. But who is Ruby? It's none of my business who Ruby is. If I don't stop snooping, I'll spoil everything. I opened the door to my room, but what about the spider mum? And what about the portrait? I quickly forgot those questions. Large boxes emblazoned with my name was piled around my sitting room. Shipping crates from Wanamaker's containing more clothing than I ever imagined one person owning. Wherever I requested 2 or 3, Danvers had ordered 6, and in some cases 12. Much more attractive groupings. Where I had thought 1 sufficient, he had demanded 2. If one gets soiled or torn. I unpacked 2 full-length black Macintoshes with velvet collars, 6 caps, a dozen cardigan vests in various colors, 2 calf-length Chesterfield coats, herringbone, 1 brown, 1 gray, 2 capped traveling ulsters, 3 4-button double-breasted suits, 1 blue, 1 brown, 1 gray, 2 all-white flannel summer suits. I'd passed them up as impractical. A dozen different pairs of trousers in all kinds of materials, and shirts. Dozens and dozens of shirts. Chambray shirts, linen shirts, percale, cotton, and flannel shirts, soft shirts, stiff bosom shirts, shirts with and without collars, polka dot shirts, burgundy shirts, blue, white, yellow, and green twilled sateen. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by shirts, I touched one after the other, while Cale sniffed and stepped from one to the other. I started to laugh. Denver's called my name, scooping in an armload of shirts, with Cale in the middle. I went out to the portico. "Oh, Robert, I forgot to tell you, you're Denver's all these shirts. I've never seen so many beautiful shirts." "I'm glad you're pleased. Now, can you dispose of your old drugget and come down to tea?" After tea, I found Brian collecting my empty boxes to cart away. "Brian, I'm sorry I missed you at the cottage. Do you forgive me?" Look at my new clothes. He smiled and nodded. Spotting a gray herringbone cap, I grabbed it up and placed it on his head before he could speak. A perfect fit. We have the same size head. It looks great with your hair. He walked to a mirror, adjusted the cap, smiled with pleasure at his jaunty appearance, and took it from his head to return to the pile. No, you must keep it. I want you to have it. He looked confused and became as delighted as a child just presented with a sweetmeat. Back he went to the mirror to re-examine himself in that cap. I picked up a similar one in blue and shared the mirror with him. When he saw the blue one, his smile disappeared. He eyed it warily. Which do you prefer, Brian? The blue or the gray? You can have either. You can have both. He chose the blue one. I tugged on a Macintosh, flipped up the velvet collar. Try the other one, Brian. See if it fits. We could have used these today. I have one. I'll bet it's not as nice as these. These are the very latest. Charles Mack himself is probably wearing one of these. Not to mention Danough Gaylord. He lifted the second coat and fingered the velvet. How old is yours? He shrugged, then held up 3 fingers. Good Lord, man. Has it a velvet collar like this? He shook his head. That settles it. 3 years old and no velvet collar? Send it to Teddy Roosevelt. It fit him better than it fit me. His shoulder muscles were more developed. He filled out clothing better than I. Happy unbirthday, Brian. You've just gotten yourself a map to go with that smart cap. Don't argue, Brian. It's yours. I want you to have it. Now, how about some shirts? He was gone. I studied myself in the mirror. I was pleased. I looked like a fashionable gent from a magazine. I was also delighted to share some of my good fortune with Brian. He wanted for nothing, but it was amusing that we wore the same size because he looked much bigger than I. In actual fact, he was much more than amusing. It was to prove itself a life-saving coincidence. After examining the rest of my finery, down to the hose, underwear, nightshirts, and dressing gowns, 1 silk, 1 wool, 1 cotton, I put everything away piece by piece, fondling each before allocating it to the bureau or closet. And then I gathered the boxes and lugged them down to the kitchen for Ambrose to store. That's fine gear you gave young Brian. When he came strutting in here, I thought he was you. What's Mr. Robert doing below stairs? I asked myself, and myself hadn't a clue. I took her for you. I did. Fancy that. We're the same size, Ambrose. You'd never think it, but we are. If you were my size, I'd invite you upstairs to choose something, too. If I was your size, I'd feel only half grown. Ta, very much. I took 'em for you. I did. It gave me quite a turn to see your lovely hair gone funny red. I left the servants' hall by the same door used earlier. The lamp was there. I'd left it. I picked it up and headed for the portico, but as I approached the patio, I heard Denver's laughing with Brian about mistaking him for me. I hastened to the front of the house and used the main staircase. I loathed sneaking around corners and vowed to mind my own business from that day forward. It proved much easier said than done, but it might have prevented my undoing. At 11 that night, Brian brought me warm milk before saying goodnight. He apologized for not having been at the cottage. He explained that Mr. Harrington needed help rubbing down Anita because his son had sprained an ankle playing with Kale. I said I knew about the ankle. I said goodnight. I don't know how I said anything. I was so stunned. I could not blow out my light. Who in God's name was in that cottage? Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.